If you remember last time we had lecture, we kind of ended on having a conversation about group cohesion. And so this is just a kind of a really quick summary of uh, what we talked about. That each of these things on the left-hand side influence the cohesion of the group and these outcomes that we hope for a good group cohesion. And we're going to see here in just a minute that one thing that I kind of want you to keep in mind is just like everything in life, we want moderation in everything. So while we've been really emphasizing this idea of cohesiveness, we're going to see that we kind of want a moderate level of cohesiveness because we still want individuals to have a sense of independence in our group. So, but to kind of review what we talked about, the important aspects of group cohesion tends to be group size. And as if you remember, it's about uh, 5, 6 to about 9, 10 participants is about the ultimate group size. Um, and then managing diversity. So in the context of last week's lecture, we talked about things such as attractiveness of members, but also if it's a mixed group with genders, male, female, that can often be a thing to manage. Um, and different racial groups can also be an issue of management in allowing everybody to have the floor, the ground, the place to process everything they do. And if you remember, I specifically talked about things like attractiveness of group members and those things in the last lecture, but this is another important area where we have to make sure we balance our own biases and whatnot in dealing in working with men and women, working with people of diverse backgrounds and races and ethnicity, um, because we need to make sure that everyone has that fair chance of treatment and being involved in the group and hearing their voice heard. Group identity, again, is just making sure that the group itself has a place of identity and purpose. If you look at, for example, examples of like AA groups, they very much tie identity into its spiritual moments. In most traditional AA classes, it's Christian and focus with identity with Christ and then identity with each other in the broader, we are in this together. We're here for each other and really building that identity within the AA setting. Okay. And it's a pretty good example of a successful group process where identity is forefront and central and can really help individuals uh, be a part of the group and dedicated to the group. And then recognizing successes in in excuse me, in some groups, um, it can get really negative, especially when people have really hard weeks. You yourself, as a facilitator, has had a stressful, hard week, and but making sure that in each group we identify the group moving forward not backwards, despite any setbacks, any failures, and the like. And an example of this is in doing relapse prevention groups. It's not uncommon. In fact, as a group facilitator, I would almost expect it that there will be individuals while they're doing the relapse prevention who will go through a relapse of their drug of choice or alcohol or gambling or whatever that group's relapse is trying to prevent. And in a successful relapse group, that is not seen as a failure of the individual or a failure of the group. it's seen as a quote unquote setback that now we can grow from. And so that's kind of an example of how to turn kind of a what would normally be seen as a failure, and especially in the United States, that's seen as a failure of the person's character, and changing it into a kind of a setback. Yes, it happened, but it doesn't need to define our success or your success, because we can grow from it and we can learn something from it to maybe hopefully prevent the next potential relapse. Okay. And group cohesiveness affects the level of participation in the group. The more cohesive the group is, the more likely you are to get participation, and the more likely you are to emphasize the goals of being accomplished, and in the group members being able to recognize that. The one area, like I just said at the beginning of this lecture, which we'll talk about here in the middle about moderation, is we want a good enough level of cohesiveness to increase participation and to work towards a common goals. But we also want a level of conformity for people to understand each other's experiences, to empathize with them, to have a sense of togetherness, but not such a high level of cohesiveness that the individual forgets about why they're there. In groups that tend to be very, very highly cohesive, the problem becomes about the group and not necessarily the individual. So group members come in and focus on others and what's the common threads in the group, instead of remembering that they're there to improve their own life and their own situation and themselves. So this is where we want to kind of manage the level of cohesiveness that exists within the group and get it to about a moderate level, but it's not where the participants lose their sense of why they're there. Okay, so kind of a review and a summary of the cohesiveness component. The other thing we want to be careful of, and if you remember at the beginning of the group lectures, I talked about the ASH studies, where individuals would even if the answer was blatantly wrong, they would agree with the other group members in order to make sure um, um, to kind of conform to what the group was trying to say. Okay. So groupthink is kind of the extension of that, where there's a desire to agree is so great that it dominates concerns for realistic appraisal or alternative course of actions. This is where, again, if we go back to here, this is where we want to be careful about the level of conformity, okay? Is that really the main things that we want to look for when we're looking for if a group is becoming overly cohesive and everyone starts to kind of say the same things, agree to the same things, disagree to the same things, is that too much cohesiveness or domination of a group by a few leaders can really lead to groupthink. And so these are the things that you want to look for. Too much cohesiveness, although you want it there, and is the group being dominated by one or two or maybe three of the group members that, because of their presence, their seeming to know what they're talking about, and their dominance leads the group to um, just agree with those few individuals instead of thinking for themselves or thinking and looking outside of this. If you want to think about this, when we look at, for example, people who are strong in their political views, well, those views tend to be projected by just a few group individuals. And then those with those political views start to do group think, and they're unable to look at alternative actions or alternative ways of looking at a problem. And so, if you want to kind of have a broader example outside the group setting, political groups are a good example. Um, Certain religious groups and whatnot are also a good example of really group think and not being able, it takes away the individual's ability to quote unquote think on their own. Okay. Um, Now, some of the things that as a facilitator you can do to kind of mitigate groupthink is stay away from time pressure. Okay, and I need to, when we get to group facilitation skills, I'm going to clarify time pressure a little bit because during a group, let's say it's 60 minutes and you have 9 participants, you need to make sure, or you need to try and encourage all 9 members of that group to at least speak one time during the group. And so that can kind of make you feel like you're being pressured to try and get to each group member. But we'll look at kind of techniques and whatnot that you can use as a facilitator to kind of relieve that pressure to make sure everyone is heard fully. Okay. The need to perform. Okay. Uh, so when there's a lot of pressure, a group member comes and you say, did you guys do your homework this week? And one group member says, no, I didn't get to it. The need to perform issue comes into play when that individual gets a lot of criticism by the other group members who did complete the homework without looking at the potential reasons why that individual didn't complete their homework. Maybe they had life issues, they had trauma occurring, or maybe big work events. And so making sure you balance individuals being engaged in the group, but realizing that performance can't always go 100%. That if you have an 8-week group, a 16-week group, a 24-week group, and the other traditional number is 52-week group, all of those have the potential of other predominant things happening in people's lives that can interfere with their ability to perform. And being sensitive to that and understanding as a facilitator is uh, what is it called? Me Modeling the behavior for your other group members. And then crisis conditions. And this is where you have to be a little bit careful. So, for example, if a group member comes in, and let's use the relapse prevention example. Maybe someone comes in and say they relapse, they had a wild night of drinking because family was in town and they'd never been sober when around family, and they just felt that pressure and that instant kind of behavioral track that led them to relapse. Okay. In these situations, you want to be careful of other group members' responses because what can happen in a crisis situation where things are unknown and whatnot is the group can start to come to one conclusion that could have prevented that individual from relapsing or prevented that crisis from occurring. Or, and it mainly comes from two sources. One, some of your participants may feel like, oh crap, that could be me. I could get into that situation and that same thing can happen to me. In the other situation, it's an emotional and visceral response. It's basically for other people hearing about a relapse, especially in a drug and alcohol group, that can set some trauma emotions or a trauma response for those individuals and will want to seek some easy relieving answers to kind of distance themselves from that person's crisis and their own situation to make them feel safe. Okay. And I will tell you in survivor groups that I did, when an individual maybe went back to their partner and the abuse started over again, or someone experienced some other type of trauma and whatnot, even within a survivor group, the group think starts to develop where they start to victim blame that individual by saying things like, well, you shouldn't have gone back to him, or saying things like, well, you shouldn't have put yourself in that situation. And so they kind of revert to that kind of, I need to psychologically and physically distance myself from that person, and our instant response is to blame that individual, because if it's the individual's fault, it's about them and not about me or any situation I have, even though I'm at risk of going back to my partner, or I'm at risk of being in a situation like that. But because they're them, it happened to them. It was their fault. And so it won't happen to me. Okay. And that's the basis of things like victim blaming. And that's what you want to be careful of when, if you're working with people who have gone through trauma. And the addiction example that I provided, for example, a relapse, is they tend to blame the individual in a group think moment if you don't manage that right. Okay. And again, when we get to facilitation skills, this is where you can model going through the crises with clients in a group setting. So we'll get to how to reduce that potential for groupthink when we get to that. Okay. We can also look at controversy. What is productive controversy? This occurs between extremes of infighting and groupthink, okay? Also known as creative abrasion, where uh, individuals in the group value different points of view, um, and facilitate creative problem solving. The kind of the instant response of individuals when two people have different points of view, and especially if you're a facilitator that wants to be a neutral um, person, is to instantly get into the uh, role of um, trying to find the middle ground for them. Okay. So you may say, wow, what Joe is saying has some credit, what Bill is saying has some credit. And if we kind of look at them in the same way, this is what could occur. And while sometimes that's a good thing to do, especially if you can't get the group to really come to a consensus, you want to think about this idea when there's different points of view in the group as this idea of creative abrasion or productive controversy. Because what you really should be doing, instead of finding a common ground for these individuals, is providing some creative problem solving. So having them debate their point of views, looking at the pros and cons of each, and helping them to come to some resolution on their own without the facilitator providing kind of the instant answer. Okay. And the other thing, kind of the difficulty about this is is that you want to eliminate the personal aspect. And this is probably where you have heard the term use I terms instead of you terms. Okay. So I feel this way, and encouraging them to make sure that their view is put in their perspective and that it's not being projected onto the person that they're having that controversy with. Okay. And so when you have controversy, different points of view in the group, it shouldn't always be seen as a negative thing. It should be seen as this is a moment of growth that we could personally going through. And again, doing things like using I statements, pro and con analyses, all of those kinds of things can really help controversy be turned into a productive conversation. Now, with that being said, one thing I want to just relate is we can use all of these facilitation skills we're learning in this class perfectly. And sometimes even creative abrasion can turn into continued controversy and become a negative aspect of the group. So I'm not saying that this is the instant solve all, but it provides an opportunity for you to at least engage the group and allow them to go through the problem solving process. But I will say it doesn't always relieve the different points of view. But it at least allowed them to develop skills of how to analyze different points of view. So um, that, that's something to kind of keep in mind. We're humans. We don't always think completely rationally when it comes to our beliefs and ideas system. All right. This is that thing that I was talking about with conformity. So when we have group level of performance, so one is a group performing really well, is when we have a moderate level of conformity. Okay. When you have low, you basically have individuals coming to group who don't, who are unable to see other people's point of view. Okay. And you're more than likely going to get nowhere with that group. When you have high conformity and low deviance, so people not willing to say, well, I don't think that would work for me, for example, but they're very high and a very cohesive group. They kind of conform to each other's ideas, then really the therapeutic model or any type of therapy you're implementing is not going to be very effective because you're not going to see the performance you need. Again, for individuals to see the value of the group, this is this end, but also remembering that they're there for themselves. And so while the group is important in self-discovery, my own point of view is also important, and there's times where I have to disagree. And this is where you get a high performing group and you get more dynamic conversations within the group. Okay. So in this, in the forming phase, some things that you want to look for to make sure that you're going to have a high performing group is members have to come to trust and accept each other. And when I say accept each other, they don't necessarily have to like each other, but they come to an appreciation that person is there. They have their own experiences, they have their own way of thinking. Maybe they're more abrasive than what I like, or maybe they're too shy for what I like, or whatever it may be. But I can accept them as a member of this group and value the things they say despite our personal differences. Okay. So this does not necessarily mean liking or friendship is an important point of view on this. It's about accepting that we all belong here and we all need to be here at this time in all of our lives. The other thing you can know if you're in the performing phase and the productivity is members are comfortable presenting ideas, okay, um, and presenting their point of view. All right. I remember being in some groups where and I'll bring this up because it's often it tends to be an issue within the group setting is things like sexuality. You know that you're in a cohesive group when a person brings up their experience as a gay man or a lesbian woman or as a transsexual. Okay. Now, those are kind of examples, but when group members are comfortable enough to say, I understand everyone's experience, but this is my experience given my identity, my experiences based on being not within the predominant population. Um, and so kind of that's just one example that you know that your group is in the right place. No, don't wait for someone to admit to those things. But when people are willing to say things that in normal social kind of formal gathering places, they don't commonly talk about and not willing to put as part of the group and the group process, that's when you know that your members are comfortable. They're comfortable with even people that they don't necessarily like, but they accept that you're heading in the right direction. The other part of it is that this should say group. I need to change some of these slides. Is focused on the tasks. And what I mean by the tasks is that you can have a highly motivated group. Let's go to relapse prevention for just a minute. You can have a highly motivated group who don't want to relapse. They talk about it, they talk about their experiences, and they talk about the broad aspects of not wanting to relapse, the reasons why not to relapse, and maybe some of the methods of not getting into a relapse. But if they're not implementing the very specific tools that they're provided, that can indicate that you're not quite at the performing level. And so, what do I mean by this? One common thing that occurs in relapse prevention is you tend to have the group members write a kind of a very short, very behavioral oriented list of things to do when they start craving. Okay. So, for example, step one might be call a sponsor, or while it usually doesn't start at that level, step one usually is change what you're doing. So if you're cleaning the house and you start having cravings, maybe you stop that and you provide something specific that you're going to do. Maybe it's go read the AA book, or go exercise, or do something else. And then if that doesn't work, it's call your sponsor or call your partner or a friend, and you let that friend know that if step one doesn't work, you'll be calling them and make sure you get their commitment. And then step three is um, maybe at that level calling the counselor or something like that. But you help them work through a list, and those are the tasks. Those are very specific tasks. And so when you come back to group and you say, okay, everyone, did you put that on your refrigerator so that it's there? And how many have needed to use your prevention list? And if you have everyone going, well, I forgot, or I got busy after group, or yeah, I did it, but I just forgot about it. That's when you know that the group really is not focused on the task, the behavior of relapse prevention. And so this is where you need to look at the level of performance in the group and really start to go back to those basic ideas and maybe go back to the norming phase of the group and go back to, okay, this is why we're here. This is our commitment. These are our rules. These are the things, and build back up into the performing phase. Okay. So these three things are kind of check marks you can use to see if your group is really in that performing phase. And I would say that the performing phase, when we think about it in a treatment sense, is when you're using some technique like cognitive behavioral therapy or EMDR or some other group-based treatment, and you are having them, you go through the activity, you role play the activity, and then you ask each individual basically how they would implement that in their life. And then you would say something like, okay, this week, this is what I want you to do. Write your list, put it on the fridge. Okay. Brittany, you have your hand up. Remember, it is being recorded. So I just want to remember that, but please, um, I'd love to answer your question.
Really quick, you said EMDR. Is that able to be done in a group setting?
It actually is, but this is the thing. This is the but about EMDR.
Okay.
There in a group setting is that it's usually you don't usually start with, for example, the bringing the group together and group apart. You bring them together, and you as the facilitator state, okay, this is what we're going to do today in our EMDR. Does anybody have any questions? And then you can do the answering questions, and other people may provide some input. And then you have them go work then individually. Um,
Oh, okay.
and and then afterwards, if it is a group, for example, it works really well, for example, in inpatient settings
Mm-hmm.
where the clients are basically together almost 24/7, because in that setting, after the EMDR, you can have them process what they experienced. Now, in the outpatient setting, you usually wouldn't do the process component after EMDR. You kind of, because they really are not together all the time, and there can be some issues with carrying that forward. So, dependent if they're inpatient or patient, the end part, the processing part may be different. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you for
Mhm.
that clarification.
You're welcome. Okay. So now what about a journey? Again, I need to change these slides. I'm using the word team again. Um, oh, I know why this says team. Never mind. Sometimes when you have short, what are really called short focus groups. I mean, these are groups that maybe be 3 weeks long. Um, there are some addiction quick intervention programs that have been presented where they have the person go to like a 3, maybe 4 week group where they do an intensive type of cognitive behavioral type of treatment thing. And usually this is reserved for individuals who, for example, may not have insurance. They might still kind of be in the denial phase of drinking, but they've lost control of their drinking. I should say they might be in some type of denial phase about being an addiction, but they recognize that their drinking or something has gotten out of control. And um, these tend to very rapidly get to the adjourning phase. Okay. Um, and so that's something to kind of keep in mind. Sometimes these groups, these very short groups, which in organizations we usually call task force or subgroups, they tend to get to the adjourning phase really quick because they understand the time limitation. Okay. So I just wanted to bring this up because some of you may be in some of those very short-term group-based situations And it may feel like you jumped from starting the group, building the team, and you didn't even get through the action phase, the performing phase of the group. And that's something you kind of want to keep control of because in short groups, the end goal people almost want in week one. Okay. And so, but kind of helping them slow down through at least the 3 or 4 weeks you have them and make sure that at least that if it's a 4 week process, that at least in the second and third week, they're focused on performing instead of looking forward to the separation and the adjourning of the group. Okay. Um, the rest of these is ways you can recognize that the group is no longer being beneficial to either a group member, a segment of the group, or sometimes the entire group. Okay. Um, Terminating task behaviors is when a group member starts saying, you know what, I've already done that. I've mastered that. I don't want to have this as homework again this week. We've gone over this over and over and over. This is when they're kind of at that point where they're like, okay, I've got this down. Can we stop rehashing it? Because I'm starting to disengage. And this usually leads to disengaging in relationships. They're kind of like there, but they stop kind of engaging into other people's issues and helping out and they stop the listening and all of those things. This is also, and this is mainly for process groups. So when we get to this, a process group is usually when someone has gone through treatment, but they want to continue having the ability to process, for example, their trauma or their addiction past. But they're at the point where they have all the coping skills and skills to handle crises that come up, further trauma that come up, further potentials of relapse. So they've already gone through the treatment component and the in the addiction area, the relapse prevention component, but they still want to continue to process in order to improve their life and to stay on kind of things is when group members start coming to the group and the facilitators in kind of an open format says, what do you guys want to talk about today in our process? And everyone goes, I don't know. I don't care. Whatever. Um, this is where you know the group is going through the adjourning and separation phase. They're starting to disengage. And maybe it's time to start to conclude that process group if they're no longer wanting to plan what they want to do for that group. Recognition of performance and give closure. So this is when individuals start to make statements like this. Maybe someone successfully prevented a relapse, and you go, and group members go, okay, you did great on that. It looks like you have this figured out. So keep doing what you're doing. And so they give closure. Hey, you've got this figured out. And so we really don't need to continue to hash this issue out if you're already being successful at this. This again is a good marker for the facilitator to consider ending the group because it's no longer even minor new issues or new nuances to issues just become very uninteresting and they try to give instant closure to it. This is probably a good time to say, okay, these guys have it. They even can apply it to even slightly new situations. And so maybe it's time for the treatment aspect or whatever aspect of the group to come to an end. Now, this one may be turnover of members rather than adjourning. So a lot of groups are what we call open groups. meaning that the group continually runs in segments. I'm thinking, for example, a lot of anger management groups that run, they usually run 24 or 36, and I think there's a 52-week one. But that's usually their timeline. And I think there's shorter ones, like a 16-week. But dependent, let's just go to 24 weeks. But they tend to be open groups. And so what does that mean? Well, you don't usually with open groups do the whole group norming phase. Okay. They're expected to come to the group and instantly go into the performance phase. All right. And usually with anger management, each group is a topic of a group. It's not really a building process. Each week you come and you talk about your anger and what you went through that week. And then the facilitator will facilitate role playing a skill for that given group. Okay. In this situation, especially when you have, let's say, individuals who have been in the group and you're at group like 18 of 24, and let's say five members leave, and now you have five brand new members. For those members who had been there for that 18 weeks, they can start to become very disengaged and start saying, I've got this. It's not a problem for me. I've figured this out. Even though, you know, technically, let's see, 18, 24, they have about six more skills. Is that right? Am I doing that math right? Seven more skills that they could potentially learn and apply for the 24 weeks. They become disengaged because they now have this new influx of newbies, as they sometimes call them, and they're like, okay, I've done all this work, and now we have these new people here, and the dynamics of the group has changed. And so it looks like they're going through an adjourning phase. They're like, I'm just going to sit the rest of these 6 or 7 sessions out and not be engaged. Okay. And this is really the hard part about having open groups, especially when you have influxes of large numbers of new members and you only have a minority of members who have been through the group thus far. Okay. So I'm going to kind of put a explanation mark on this one because we'll talk more specifically about open groups when we go through facilitation skills and different facilitation techniques that you kind of can help groups maintain some level of cohesiveness, even though you constantly have new and old members leaving and coming and leaving. Okay. But that's one thing to consider when you're doing an open type of group. Okay. And then the last part that I kind of want to talk about, and this is going to kind of be a general conversation for the sake of this lecture, is the effects of cultures on groups. We kind of talked about it, and we'll talk about it a little bit more, well, not quite a bit more when we get to facilitation skills. We've already talked about being sensitive to cultural norms as far as eye contact, how close you get to the individual. You know, we handshake here in the United States, but if you go to France, expect a kiss on the cheek. Those kinds of things and closeness and physical closeness and space tend to be cultural issues. In this, for the sake of this lecture, I just want you to kind of have this broad perspective on the influence of culture, talking about collectivism versus individualism. Okay, collectivism is the notion. Well, I'm going to start with individualism because it's probably the more relatable for the broader United States Western kind of zeitgeist or the influence of Western culture on especially the way we operate kind of here in the United States is individualism assumes that it's kind of the pull your bootstraps up, and that's why you're not successful. Is you're not successful because of you. You are successful because of you. Okay. In an individualistic culture, your successes, your failures are due to your character, your behaviors. If you're um, unhoused, if you use this example, if you're unhoused, it's because you're lazy, you don't want to work. There's something wrong with you. You have mental illness. You can't control your drug use. And you probably have heard all of those terms before, right? Um, and then Bill Gates is successful because Bill Gates is motivated, he's smart, he knows good decision-making skills. Even though if you look at Bill Gates' life, his success has been due more to luck than probably intellectual ability. Um, and those kinds of things. So that's kind of the individualistic. On the extreme end, that's individualism. Okay. Collectivism is that my failures are my group's failures, my successes are my group's successes, my group failures are my failures, and my group successes are my successes. So it's less about the individual, but it's about the group. Okay. And so when we look at, for example, this in the group setting, those who are high in collectivism tend to very quickly do things like cohesiveness, group responsibility. We're in it here together. For individuals who are high in individualistic perspectives, we're less comfortable. If you have a highly individualistic group, they tend to have difficult opening up. They have difficult admitting about their failures because they assume everybody's going to think it's about them. It's their fault. And so that's something when we look at this, we need to keep in mind the community that we're working with, and looking at, the country they come from, the predominant culture that influences their local culture, how that influences them, to kind of keep that in mind because the tempting part is to assume that this individual doesn't want group treatment because they're not comfortable coming out and saying what they need to say in the group setting. For these individuals, they may have difficulty seeing their own individualistic um, experiences. What I mean by that is they're kind of more susceptible to group thinking, and that what the group is saying is something that I should make sure I follow. But as I think I mentioned before, the way group member A solved the problem is a good recommendation for the group member B to process. But given group individual B's unique existence and difference in experiences, uh, it may not work for that individual. Okay. So on this broader level, I would encourage you to really pay attention to the individual, where they're coming from. What is their view of themselves? Are they very individualistic? They believe that if you're successful, it's because you pulled your bootstraps up and you made yourself successful, or are they more about the community? My community is important to me. I need to be successful because that will make my community successful. And that can kind of give you an idea of how you want to engage those group members. Okay. So always keep culture and individual experiences in mind and how they frame things. because not only can you make sure, in collective group, you want to be a little bit more concerned about group think. In individualistic groups, you want to be more sensitive to individuals and their own experience, but you can also use these to capitalize. So what would it mean for you to not relapse to your family or your group in the collectivist thing? And in the individualistic perspective, maybe you take on, so what are the individual skills you feel you need to develop to make yourself successful? There's a slight terminology. The end goal is the same, to help them develop skills and coping abilities to deal with their situation, but you have to approach it from their cultural mindset of what's important to them. Is it important because they want to be proud of their group, or because they feel like their successes and failures are because of something that might be wrong with them? That you're going to use the same coping skill, but you're going to frame it differently dependent upon the group members' cultural perspective. And this is a very broad perspective, to kind of just highlight the importance of considering and understanding the people you serve and their approaches to understanding the world, even from that broader cultural perspective. Okay. All right. I'm going to stop my sharing and I'm going to stop our recording.